everyone, it's Neil here from 3D Tutor, back today with another complete guide, and this time we're looking at turning iconic buildings into stylized 3D models using Blender, Substance Painter and of course Unreal Engine. So if that sounds something you would like to see, then stay tuned. If you have any ideas for your own buildings in your own country or your own culture, then please drop the comments down below. We'll check them out and we'll see if they make a good actual 3D model. If you have any concept art or unfinished models, then again, dropping in the links below, we'll check those out and we may use them in an upcoming complete guide. So as always, before we begin, if you're interested in how long London Bridge or Tower Bridge, as some people call it, I can't actually decide which one it is, then stay till the end. We'll go through how hard it was to create and how long each part took. As always, a link to the full Blender and Unreal build is down below, along with our Patreon link. Now if you've ever wanted to learn 3D modeling and game design, then there's never been a better time to join our Patreon. Over 300 hours of courses, nearly 20 projects, all for the price of a cup of coffee. So if that sounds pretty incredible to you, and you want to help support the channel in this difficult time, then as I say, links down below. We release 2 to 3 videos a week here and now have nearly 20 complete guides along with hundreds of free downloads like material and texture packs, along with things like this week's free content and massive decal pack. So if you missed that video, head on over to our channel where you can check it out. And while you're there, hit that subscribe button, hit that bell, and then you'll know when we're actually releasing new content, which as I say is 2 to 3 times a week. This model comes with its own download pack, which includes all textures, a pack blend file, an Unreal Engine project, and also, best of all, it's now on Sketchfab. So you can check out all of our complete guides, all of the models that we actually created in Blender 3 and Unreal Engine 5. This is great because you can check them out before you actually download them. But enough of all that, what you're here for is the complete guide. So this is how we created Blender 3 to Unreal Engine 5, London Bridge, 3D model and environment. Thanks a lot everyone. So here we are in the modeling section, and the first thing I'm going to do is try and create the actual entranceways to the actual London Bridge. And the reason I'm starting there is because then it gives me a sense of actual scale, because bearing in mind that going through this London Bridge, we actually need things like cars and buses and things like that. So what I'm going to do first of all is create the actual dome part where all the traffic passes through, and then I can actually build off that. Now you would think most of the time that you would create the actual length of the bridge, but instead I would actually say it's better off to create the actual towers and then mirror them over and then create the bridge once you've got the scale of the towers. I think that makes it much easier. So pretty much the actual start of this is pretty simple. At the moment I'm just creating a boolean, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to stick it in that cube, use the boolean modifier just to cut away my hole, and then I'm going to bring back those actual inserts that I've already created. So there you go, you can see that's how I actually put that together, and then I'm just going to mirror that bottom part over to the other side. Now when I actually built this, I realized pretty quickly that there was no way that this was long enough for the actual towers. So basically I just had to cut it away, delete the outer edges and then mirror it over to the other side. I think I'll do that in a minute. Oh, I actually redo then the actual inserts, bevel them off, extrude them out, and then we end up with something like that. Alright, so now I'm just working on the actual front of them. You can see there are some intricate parts all over London Bridge. Now the thing is, this sort of iconic building you can take so far, or you can do it so small if you like. And the reason for that is that it has so many intricate parts that you literally could take 2 months actually creating this, get it exactly right. What we went for is a more stylized look, which means that basically you take all of the parts on it and you basically simplify them into kind of blocks. So you end up with a really nice actual feel for London Bridge. But if you go and look at closer inspection, you will see that a lot of it is made up of textures and not actually modeling, because it would simply just take too long. I mean, there's so much stonework on this actual bridge and other iconic buildings around the world that we just simply haven't got time. And if we made this actually a video once we've done that, it would be, sort of 20 hours long or something like that. Alright, again, what I'm doing here now is I'm setting myself up in each of the levels, because if you look, London Bridge actually has 3, 4, 5 levels to it, and those bands that run across there basically split every one up. Now I am using references as well. I'm not using any schematics. I did use some schematics for the actual bridge. What I want to do is just free build on here, get a nice actual stylized building, something that you might be able to use in city skylines or something like that, that sim style look to it. That's what I'm actually going for here. So again, you can see with these bits, all I'm doing is adding in edge loops. It's basically simple modeling at this point. There is nothing really difficult here. Just edge loops, extruding and inserting is basically all I'm using. Now for the windows, as you can see, I couldn't quite get this window right. I kept trying to bevel it. So I'll grab an edge loop, I bevel it, but it wasn't actually working for me. So what I decided to do is just restart it and then bring in an edge loop in the middle and down the sides, bevel them off, and then insert all of that. And what that does is it gives you a really beautiful window frame. I might actually do a small tutorial on doing window frames. I've already got one on the channel, but it's pretty old now, and I've changed my technique near enough completely since actually putting that out. Alright, so now I'm actually at this point deciding how far to take this model. So in other words, there's so much stonework that I need to decide how much detail we actually put in. As I say, if we go full ball detail, it's going to take, you know, literally over 100 hours. So we need to find a happy medium, and that's what I'm really doing actually when I'm actually creating this. This first actual level will determine the rest of the build. Now you see there, I couldn't actually bring in an edge loop. So what I did was, I grabbed the whole thing, I went up to the bisect tool, I bisected it off, and then what it leaves is you're able then to bring in edge loops again. So now you can see I'm just working on the second level. So where is the second level going to be? And then once I've done that, I can actually start building up from that. It's also great because when you're working on levels like this, you can actually decide where you need to put your windows, how big they need to be, and things like that. So it's actually really good that it's actually got these levels here. If it's just a flat kind of canvas, it does make it a lot difficult to actually visualize where things need to be. So you can see there, I used pretty much the same technique as I did with the lower windows. All I did there is I brought in a cylinder, I extruded it down, and then I grabbed the edge loops that I want to have as the window frames. I beveled those frames off first, and then what I did is I grabbed everything, pressed the insert button, and what that'll do is bring everything in, and then you just grab all of the actual faces going around the outside, extrude them out, and then you end up with your actual frame that looks like this. Just be sure to extrude them a little bit further out. So the main frame, as you can see going around the side, make sure you extrude that a little bit further out than the little frames that go around the actual windows. Alright, so now we're actually working on the second level. Again here, with the second level, there's a lot of stonework, so we just have to be careful that we don't go over the top of it. We want to keep it relatively simplistic. And also I think some people would probably, you know, pull these straight up to the top and get like kind of the whole build in one go, so the whole of the actual tower. But I prefer much more to work up in levels. I just find it much easier to build as I go along. It's a bit like the printer man video where he, you know, kind of prints his drawing out. Well, I prefer also to work like that. You can see that I'm using proportional editing a little bit just to get that actual shape that I'm actually looking for. You can do that manually without proportional editing on, but I would suggest like always looking at the proportional editing option if you've got anything like that you need to build. It's a really handy tool. Alright, so here I think on this bit we have a part that really juts out. So, but it's not made of wood or anything like that, it's actually made of stone. You can see there as well, that part there, I actually used Control B to bevel that off. But as I beveled it off, I then went down to the options on the left hand side. I opened up the menu, and you can see there you can actually change the shape. So you can change it to actually be inverted, and that's what I did there to create that stonework. Now you can see in this actual balcony, it's a mess on the back. So you can see those actual polygons on the back are sticking out. they're n-gons and non-manifold edges, which means they're not actually fitting correctly, and I need to go in and fix those. So just be aware if you're doing anything like that with the bevel, it does create certain issues, so just make sure that you go in and fix them. And as you see, I'm going to fix them in a minute. Or maybe towards the end, we'll see. So now I made a huge window, and I'm going to actually split it up in an easy way by just bringing some stonework in and covering it over the top, like so. There we go. Now I come and actually fix them. So what I did was I grabbed each one of those vertices. I pressed I pressed F, and what that did is it created an edge across both of those vertices. And then I grabbed all of them going around the outside. I pressed Alt F, and what that'll do is actually fill them in for you. And you can see there they look really nice. With these windows as well being so small, so the actual frames of the windows, just be careful when you come to bevel everything. We have had some problems bringing them into Sketchfab and things like that, and the reason is because the edges when you bevel them are so close together on the frames, it actually causes problems when you're trying to import them into Blender. So I had to do import them into Sketchfab. So what I had to do when I was importing them into Sketchfab is I had to go back to those frames and delete all those bevels I had. It's not so much of an issue because they're really small, just a really small detail. But what I tend to do is get a bit lazy and join the frames up with the rest of the building and then bevel everything off. Now that creates a lot more polygons. And because we're actually doing them complete guides like this for YouTube, we just want it to be relatively quick, and not every building is completely optimized. There are parts of it, of course, that are optimized, but a lot of it isn't. So if we were actually doing this for a game or something, we'd be a lot more careful with our optimization. So now you can see pretty much the same thing as what I've done before. It's pretty much build windows, build stonework on the front of it, using pretty much the same actual tools and modeling. You can see there I brought it out as I told you before, then I brought out the outer, and then you can see just slightly further. Then what I do is I always use the Boolean tool to actually put those inwards. So basically they look far more realistic if you do that. Now the best way to do it is to get your window, decide what size you want to do it, grab the outside of the window, press Shift D, then to duplicate just that edge, extrude it out straight, and then you can fill in both of the faces, and then you'll end up with a beautiful Boolean to actually use. It's exactly the same size the windows you're using, so then you can just push your windows back, and hey presto, they're actually in the building and look pretty realistic. Alright, so now what I'm doing is I'm going up, I'm checking everything just to make sure that everything is actually okay, making sure the mesh is okay and things like that. Now on the cylinders and things like that, you don't need to go in and actually triangulate faces or anything like that, because what you can do is when you export them out, you can actually triangulate faces. So if you send it through to Substance Painter or Unreal Engine, you can either go in and fix all of those cylinder tops, which will of course be n-gons, or you can just actually triangulate them when you actually export them out. Now you can see what I'm doing is because I've actually done the main part of the tower, I'm actually now working on those struts that go up and beveling them off exactly where they need to be. So I'm just using two bevels there and extruding. Now what I'm doing is when I extrude, I'm not just pressing E and S, I'm actually pressing Alt S, and what that does is it'll extrude them out in a really straight fashion. So just make sure that you press Alt S to actually extrude them out. So what I did there was I actually extruded them, pressed the S button to pull them out, and I kept it on medium point. And what that means is they'll all come out, but what it will do is it'll make them kind of larger. So then what you need to do is you need to bring them in and then change it to individual origins. And then what you can do is you can actually make those actual bars that are running up the top of those roofs smaller, because what you're doing is you're actually changing the scale of the tips of them by an individual origin. Now what I did with this was, this is me starting this, I think I'm going and change this in the end, but I'm trying to bevel it and then use the actual, I actually started it again there. I was actually trying to use the wireframe modifier to actually create this, but in the end it just worked out far easier just to create it by freehand, which sometimes it is. So there I'm grabbing them, Control B to actually make the bevel, inserting, extruding out, and then you can see it's pretty easy to actually create this. So now you can see that we've got the top on there. It really actually starting to come together now. I'm just actually realised that I've got it the wrong way round. If you look at Tower Bridge, the roof is slanting up that way. I had it on the other way. So what I just need to do is I just need to split it away from the rest of the tower and then quickly spin it round. So now what I'm thinking of is building the actual base of this before I actually mirror it over to the side, because then it's going to give me a good idea of how actual big this tower, well, this base is, because I need to actually get that right. Because pretty much if you look at any kind of iconic building, pick out the most iconic bits, because they are the things that actually make the building. Now if you look at London Bridge, you don't actually really look at the bottom part of it, and this is where these struts come out. But take a look at London Bridge and you will see they're very, very weirdly shaped. They look like shoes on the bottom of them. So I need to make sure I get those right, because if I don't get those parts right, then it's gonna, the rest of the build won't be believable. So you can see here, that's what I'm actually trying to do here. Now it's to make the water flow better around the bridge. But if you look at most bridges, they don't actually have these kind of shoes on them, especially not built out of bricks like the Tower Bridge is built out of. So now I've got those in, what I want to do now is check out my actual road. Now I've brought in a schematic here, and the reason I brought in a schematic, you can see that my tower actually nearly fits, even by doing it by freehand. Now I brought in my schematic because of the fact that it's going to be very, very difficult to actually work out where all of these kind of cables go and things like that, and I know I need to get those perfectly right. So what I did was I actually brought in a curve, it was a path, and then I pulled it out to each point where they need to go, and then basically I right clicked and inserted more actual vertices. That gave me then a lot of vertices to move things around with. And now you can see I've actually converted them to mesh. I grab each of those faces going all the way around. I press E and enter Alt S, and then what I can do is I can bring them out and give us that actual look that I'm going for. Bring another cylinder, put it under each one, and then just pull the tops of them down to where they need to be. That made it really, really easy actually to create these cables. And also I decided that instead of actually creating the whole of London Bridge, it wouldn't actually be as aesthetically pleasing to try and get that in frame. So you would end up looking at London or Tower Bridge, and it would be massively long, which wouldn't bode very well if you want to take close-up shots. So I decided to cut it off actual short, get the main part of the building in, and I think it's actually looking much, much better the way I did it. After all, we weren't going here for a complete replica or anything like that. We were going for something that we could put in a game or something like that. And also it's pretty stylized. Now this was the hardest part. So what I did was I brought a frame in, I pulled it out, I gave it some edge loops, and you can see here what I'm doing is I'm actually trying to think how to actually do this. I was actually going to get each point, join them together with J, but in the end decided to just give it some edge loops. And instead of that, use decimate. How do you use decimate, you might ask? Well, you're going to see in a minute. You can see what I'm doing there. I don't think this is actually the way I did it. There you go, I brought in a wireframe instead. So I didn't use decimate on here actually, I did use just the wireframe. So basically I created the mesh. So create any look that you want in. For instance here you can see it's those cross sections of the metal. And then what you want to do is you just want to click on the wireframe, and you'll see that it actually puts mesh wherever there's actually an edge, and so it makes it really easy to create these sort of metal structures that go over there. I think a bit later on I actually do use the decimate. So if you go to the decimate, you can actually create that cross actual section without actually doing it by hand. Alright, so now you can see that I'm trying to just pull everything together, working out where I actually finished this, where the sides finished. When you're looking on a reference, you can see kind of the overall structure, but unless you've been there and took some close-up images, it's really hard sometimes to find, you know, complete references of the exact part that you need. So sometimes you're just kind of winging it, I guess you would call it. But as long as you get the whole shape of the structure, you can kind of fill in those, you know, missing pieces. Now just trying to tie it all together so it looks right. And I had a problem there, as you can see, with the Solidify. It wouldn't work. If it doesn't work, by the way, Solidify, just check your normals. And if you can't get it to work like I didn't, just fill it back in and then we can get it to work like that. So remember, if your Solidify isn't working, just go up to the top right hand side where those two interlocking balls are, go down to where it says check face orientation, and then just press shift down to turn them around, and that should fix the issue. If you're still having issues, just make sure you're in object mode, press Ctrl A and reset all the transformations, and that again should fit any issues that you have. Alright, so now I'm just creating the smaller windows, basically finishing off this tower because it's basically mirrored. So not only is it mirrored to the other side, but it's mirrored all the way around, but you've got two sides of it basically, and then the rest is mirrored. So you can see I'm trying to use the same technique I've used before, and it didn't really work out. So what I did was I used my, as you can see, there we go, that's what I used. So I went up to mesh, I used the bisect tool and tried to do it that way. It didn't work, so instead I went in, building that top, so grabbed, yeah, you can see I'm just playing around with it at the moment. I can't get it to work, so in the end we just do it the easy way, split it all up and then bring in some edge loops and then just pull them down individually to get that round edge. Sometimes the most simple method is the easiest one. And now again you can see I'm just beveling that off, pulling back my windows. And you can see there actually how much more realism it actually adds by just putting your windows set back away from the wall. Instead of having your windows just jutting out from the face, always set them back and you'll see your models really start to come to life doing that. You can see at this point, apart from maybe the cables holding the bridge, that pretty much the whole build in this is basically using the same tools, which, you know, are insert, extrude, bevel, things like that, and Control R, which is add edge loop. So there's nothing actually complicated about this build at the moment. The hardest part is pulling it all together and just keeping up the build, not getting bored. You know, seeing a vision in the end and then pulling it all together is the hardest part. Checking your references and knowing how to actually build each of those parts. Well, because this has got so many windows, pretty much any beginner could build the actual tower. The hard parts are just, you know, the round edges at the bottom, the cables going down the side. So I would suggest if you're new, try just building the tower and not the cables or anything like that. And building the tower alone, you'll get a lot of satisfaction from actually creating something like that. Alright, so now we're just putting the main roads in, and of course I also wanted to animate this, so I want to make sure that bringing that main road in, it actually is as a halfway point. It's actually hard to decide where the halfway point should be, how big the actual you know, this road should be as well, because when you actually rotate it, you need to see how high up it's actually going to be. Now if you look at a London Bridge, or Tower Bridge as some people call it, you will see that when they bring up those actual roads, most of the images I've seen, they don't actually come up all the way, it only comes up so far. So I've actually trying to actually replicate that. I'm also trying to replicate, because I did the other side, you know, on the right hand side, the middle of it should also look very much the same. So whenever you're building something, just make sure that it you know, it's pretty much the same going all the way through the build. I wouldn't want this part of the bridge looking different from the other side. Now what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to basically work out, okay, so if I'm going to animate this and lift it up, how it needs to look as if something's actually controlling that. If I didn't have anything down at this bottom part, where that insert is, that boolean that I've put in there, then it wouldn't look realistic, because the bridge would just look like it's floating up or something like that, like it's magic. It wouldn't actually look like there's a massive, you know, mechanical thing down there that's actually controlling it. Alright, so now I'm trying to just create the part in here, which again is pretty much similar to the cables. So let's see if I do it this time. there you go, I'm actually bringing that in now. Pressing J, so I'm grabbing each one of those, pressing J, and then what I'm doing is turning it into wireframe. So we did do it the wireframe way again. So basically I'm just grabbing two verts, pressing J, and what that does is it gives you an edge between them. Really nice way of getting rid of, you know, things like n-gons, fixing meshes you have, you know, topology issues with. Alright, so now I'm just putting in some real simple, you know, things that basically look like, you know, there's some huge mechanical piece which is going to lift them up and down. So now I'm actually going, because I'm going to actually mirror this over to the other side, I'm going down each of my pieces, right clicking shade and smooth, going over to my little triangle on the right hand side, clicking on auto smooth, then going over, pressing Ctrl A, right clicking, setting my origin to where it needs to go, and then finally adding a modifier, and I'm bringing in a bevel modifier. And normally I'm turning that all the way down or even going further than that. So if you turn it down to 0.01, if it's not working, if the bevel's looking too much, try 0.005 or something like that. Sometimes I do that, but what I'm trying to do is get consistency throughout the build. And when you're beveling, you won't actually end up with consistency with the same numbers on the bevel. So just make sure that you're turning them down or putting them up so it's just consistent all the way around. Now what you will find as well is when you're beveling something, it's better to probably, the bigger the piece, then turn your bevel up a little bit higher, I would say. So the smaller pieces, they only want a tiny, tiny sliver of a bevel. So now you can see what I'm doing is I'm doing exactly the same thing, and why I'm doing this is basically the build at this point is nearly complete. I actually need to mirror it over to the other side, so I'm getting everything, you know, in place, everything beveled off, fixing any parts I might have. And I did actually have some issues with this, so basically I near enough rebuilt this just part by part, just making sure the topology is correct. Just wasn't working out for me, so. And then once I've got all that, then I can mirror it over to the other side, put it in the center, and finally then I can actually start on that top middle part. So you can see here I'm just bringing it in, making sure they're not actually touching, so there's a little tiny gap down there. And now what I'm doing is checking out my lighting. So what I'm doing there is I'm going to a blend file where I have an actual HDRI setup, which you'll see in a minute, and from the HDRI setup I can actually control the gradient and things like that. By the way, this HDRI setup is available with all of my courses. It is available because they're packed blend files, that it also comes with that actual setup as well. So if you want to get your hands on that, just go and download it. Pretty much anything from our Gumroad, and you'll actually get, I think even some of the free things have it in there as well. It's basically just in there to help with the lighting. So you can see there how nice the actual lighting look, because what you can do is then, with that actual setup, you can download any HDRI you might actually have, and then bring it in and slot it in that actual setup. Then you can change basically the gradient. So instead of having the HDRI in the background, you can simply just plug it in, change the gradient then, so you have full control over the colors and things like that, and basically change the strength of the HDRI and get a really, really nice lighting setup. Pretty much what you see on the actual rendered image for the thumbnail, that was done with this setup with very, very little other work. Now I think on that one there, where you see those crosses, I did use the decimate. So these iterations, so you hit the middle option on the decimate, then you hit 1 on iterations, and what it'll do is it'll basically take every edge loop and turn it into a cross. So then you'll end up with this kind of look that you can see here. And then finally what you can do is you can apply that, or you can subdivide it if you want more crosses, for instance. And then what you can do is you can go in and use your wireframe, and you will end up with that look very, very quickly. So now basically we come into the actual finished parts of the actual middle part, so basically the whole of the bridge. And these parts actually, compared to the other parts, they're quite simple now we've done the rest of it. What we need to make sure of here when we're doing this though is that those parts don't look too thin. And when I looked at them, I could see like they were too far away from each other. I was looking at my reference and looking how thick they actually are. So I had to move everything out, which was a pain, to be honest, because I built it like that, but I managed to do it in the end. Alright, so the other thing is when you're building anything like this, it's hard to decide how to actually show it. So in the end, I decided to do this kind of oval look to it. And it's always a good idea if you're doing something like that, use the same textures on the actual plinth or whatever you're sitting the model on, like the brick textures or something like that, because you need to think about that, because if you don't, then you can't create the whole Thames. So you need to have a cut-off point somewhere. Better if you control the cut-off point rather than leaving it to the imagination actually on something like this. So we could have just put some water in there, not at this plinth, but then where does the water end? Do you show the underneath of the water? Is the water going to be see-through? Because in the Thames, if you look at the water, it's not very see-through, it's actually very dirty, so you're going to create problems for yourself. So better actually to contain the actual model as it would be in real life. If you went to a shop and someone had modeled this, it would be contained on something. So either in a snow globe, on a plinth or something like that. So better to actually do that. So here you can see actually to finish this off, what I'm actually trying to do now is just create the top. I had a few problems here just getting that stonework to line up with the top using the solidify. But once I've done it, then you can see exactly what I did. I basically gave it a bricks underneath all the way around and ended it then with a stone kind of topping it. And the reason I did that is obviously because it really actually goes with the actual build of the of London Bridge, so that's why I did it. I wanted the ends, because they were cut off, I wanted it to be as though it's carrying on, the bridge is carrying on, so I wanted those actual side parts to look a little bit different. So I just raised them up a little bit, made sure that those cylinders on the end were still visible, and there we go. I think the last thing now that we actually look at is how we're going to light it. So at this point it's really a good idea of adding any extra lights and things like that. So what we decided to do actually, I'm not sure actually if this is in the build, it might be, but we actually put some spotlights on there that I created, and then we use those in Unreal Engine actually to light up the bridge, because the bridge, London Bridge is actually lit up really nicely at night actually. So now I'm bringing in an ocean modifier. I'm adding that to my plane, and it's not so obvious when you're using ocean modifiers and things like this, what all these buttons do and how to use it. So you've just got to really play around with it, and that's what I did to actually get this to look the way I wanted it. I only wanted actually a little bit of displacement on my plane. It just needed to be a tiny bit, because I knew when I passed it over to Lucas in Substance Painter, he was going to make all that foam and things like that. So it just needed to have that slight ripple. After all, the Thames, it's not like a rapids like Niagara Falls or something like that. It's pretty calm actually most of the year. Alright, so when I'd done that, what I did was I brought in a cylinder, I extruded out the edges, and I used that actually as a boolean, and then it fit perfectly in my scene. Just made it a little bit bigger, and there we go. Now I want to make sure it's just any parts that aren't done correctly, and I can see the sides of the actual bridge, they're not high enough, so any car is just going to go straight over the bridge, over the side into the Thames, and I don't really want that. So let's pull those up a little bit and make them a little bit higher. These are like the finishing touches just to make sure everything is correct before handing over to Luke. Now I'm doing is I'm just applying any of the modifiers. And on this one, I don't think we actually go in and show you all of the UV unwrapping. If you want to see any of that, then check out our other complete guides, because at the end of every one, we show the complete process of actually unwrapping the models, applying all the materials. But we thought on this case, it's already a long video, there's no point in doing that. Alright, so what I'm doing now is I'm actually coming to animate them, and the first thing I'm doing is I'm checking where the angle needs to be like that. You can't actually see there's anything there, so it looks like they're just floating in the air, as I said. So we need to give the illusion that there's something there operating this. Once I've got that, then I can bring in my first bone. Now the problem is always bring in a root bone. So bring in a root bone, set it right in the center, and then that'll make sure you don't have any problems sending it through to something like SketchUp or even Unreal Engine. The other thing is, make sure with the armature you always rename it from armature to something else. So here it could be London Bridge armature, anything but armature. The reason for that is there is a bug in Unreal Engine. When you send it out, the animation, if it's called armature, it just doesn't work correctly. Alright, so you can see now what I'm doing is I'm just raising it up where I need to. I'm putting in the actual keyframes and things like that. You can see what I've done with those two parts is I've attached them with Control P to that root bone. So you can see that wherever that root bone goes, the bridge goes with it. And what that does is it sets it in place, because that root bone has no weight in it. There's no weight attached to anything. All the weight is on the other parts. And pretty much now we're done. We're just doing the final touches, checking the lighting last of all, checking the animation, and there we go, everyone. That is it. That is how I created London, or Tower Bridge, whichever way you want to call it, the 3D modeling part. Alright everyone, so I'll see you on the next one. Thanks a lot. Bye bye.
Hello and welcome everyone to the texturing part of the video, in which we're going to make use out of the Substance Painter in order to texture the London Tower Bridge. So to start it off, I just brought myself the FBX file of the bridge, and while checking it out how it looks within the Substance Painter, I realized that some of the faces were not looking quite as well, especially near the windows. It looked like some of the triangles were going across them, and the reason that was happening was because the mesh itself was using n-gons, so it had multiple vertices on one face. And Substance Painter often tries to triangulate all the mesh in order to give us the right kind of results, but sometimes it just fails to triangulate it, so we need to make sure we go back onto Blender real quick, and to fix that we just triangulate all the mesh, and then just to tidy it up we set them from triangles to quads, and this gives us a nice type of a mesh to work with. Then afterwards I just baked out the rest of the mesh. I start off by getting a simple ambient bake that's in low resolution just to check that everything is in order. And after I'm happy with it, I just bake everything out in 4K resolution, including normals, ambient occlusion, curvature maps, which will help us out in order to create smart materials later on. So to start off the process, I wanted to get myself a real nice kind of a concrete look out of the bridge. So I was just playing around with the values with the default concrete that we have within Substance Painter, and I was trying to overlay one on top of each other in order to get a nicer type of result. And also by default the values for the height maps were a little bit too intense, a little bit too high, so what I did was I simply lowered the opacity for the overall kind of a value within the height level channel, and that seemed to have worked. It allowed us to get a nicer kind of a look out of a base concrete type of a material, which we're then going to make use out of in order to set ourselves the bricks for the front section of the tower. So by looking at multiple references, by the way, in order to set it up properly, I often like to make use out of the PureRef, just so I could visualize how the entire look of an actual building is colored and textured and whatnot, what kind of bricks it has. So it's a really useful type of a software. But anyways, moving on, in order to set up the bricks, I needed to get some bricks that are actually a little bit kind of a messy at the very front, and they have more of a distortion, they have chipped off parts, and some of them are sticking out a little bit more. And a great way to create custom bricks is actually to make use out of a brick generator from within the Substance Painter that allows us to create any type of tilt, slopes or height variations that we want, and then we're able to get a very base out of those bricks. And afterwards I used warping in order to kind of distort the bricks a little bit to chip them off on the sides, and I made sure I make an anchor point from that mask, which then allowed me to use a curvature mask in order to kind of darken the edges in between those bricks, and this way we're able to highlight some of those bricks popping off as well. So that was quite nice as well. So afterwards, after we were happy with that, all we had to do was just simply apply it onto the rest of our tower, those kind of brick patterns, and just make sure it looks quite nice throughout in this entire kind of a section. And then going back to the tower, I realized that some of the pieces are actually, for the bricks, they have a more of a smooth type of a look. So I just made sure to actually make use out of the same kind of a brick mask that we had previously, just duplicate the entire folder that we had for the small material. And I just lowered down the height intensity and the slope variation of those brick masks, which then gave us a bit of an issue that we didn't have a lot of a color variation out of those bricks. So I actually made a copy out of this entire mask for the bricks, and I just applied a sort of a slight color variation on top of them, which gave us some nice results. The downside of it though is that whenever we want to adjust the pattern, we can't just simply do it for one of them. We have to make sure we have the same values on both of them, otherwise they're not going to match in regards to the pattern and the height channel as well as the color channel that has a different layer wouldn't quite match basically. So we got to make sure we're careful whenever we are adjusting those. So yeah, afterwards we had to make sure we had some variation in between the tower as well, some supports for the concrete and whatnot, a more plain look without the type of a brick pattern that we had. So I made use out of the concrete that we had previously set up for the bricks, and I actually just adjusted a couple of pattern variations as well as the scale and of course the color for them, and it turned out quite alright in regards to the color itself. But then all I had to do was just simply apply it to the rest of those areas within the tower. So wherever there is a bit of a support, we just had to make sure we mask them out. And I was actually struggling at the very start in order to figure out how to mask everything out. And actually what I did was I made use out of the orthographic view in order to set it to the side so it wouldn't get distorted in regards to the perspective. And then all I had to do was just simply mask out the lines for where the support of those concrete beams go. And then I had to, of course, make use out of a black mask in order to kind of remove this entire concrete material from the sides of where I masked out a little bit too much out of my material. And yeah, it turned out quite alright. It was a pretty fast process, but because there's so much little detail, we of course need to work on our masking values and set everything properly, and it was quite a bit of a nuisance until I realized that we actually have symmetry, so I'm going to make use out of that. Downside of this though is because I'm actually making use out of two materials, one for each one of the towers. We are struggling a little bit in regards to that, as in we can't actually texture both of the towers at the same time. So what I had to do was I just simply used symmetry on one tower, and we were able to kind of mask out the material for the windows, for example, to just quickly mask the texture in. And as for the windows itself, I was actually making use out of a stylized glass that I had within my library, and it's actually quite a simple material, although it looks a bit complex maybe on a first glance. But basically it's a base material with a low roughness value and a somewhat of a high metallic value. The reason being that we use metallic value within our glass is that otherwise it looks quite plasticky, so a value of 0.8 is usually what I use whenever I set up a glass material. Then afterwards we set up some additional like roughness values on top of it as another fill layer with a mask, and that gives us some nice results for the glass. And I'm going to come back to that in a bit though, but because I realized that it didn't look quite as well, but that's going to be in a bit. So now I went on and continued my process in regards to texturing, and this time I continued on with the roof. I wanted to set up a really nice pattern for the top section of this roof, and I was trying to figure out on what to do in regards to the pattern. Right now it doesn't look quite as well because some of the pattern is actually going sideways. I am going to change that to make sure that the pattern is actually using triplanar projection, which will make sure that every pattern is being faced in the right kind of a way. But yeah, once I placed out a nice type of a pattern, I made use out of an anchor point and set it up to that material, which allowed me to make use out of the curvature mask in order to highlight some of those edges within the tiles themselves. And in order to get a better kind of a shape, I also made use out of a dirt smart mask as well, which allowed me to kind of mask out a bit of an extra grunge to the side of the overall shape of a roof, which turned out quite alright. Of course, in order to blend it in properly, I made use out of that anchor point I did previously in order to get a better results out of a mask and kind of get a nicer overlay. And yeah, once I was happy with that, I went on to continue the texturing process in regards to blue highlight type of a detail for the tower. I was trying to figure out how I'm going to do it, and I wanted to get a really nice kind of a metallic material for them. But if we go in regards to the metallic values, if we go to a complete metallic type of a look, it doesn't look quite as right because If you set a metallic value to just pure 1 and just completely metallic, it wouldn't look quite as right, because you'd usually use these type of values when you want to get a pure type of a metal. So if you want to get a painted type of a metal or a bit of an extra grunge on top of it, some dirt maybe, you'd naturally end up lowering that value down. So it's not going to look quite as metallic, but it'll look more natural that way if you end up just getting the base kind of a metal set up as a value of 0.8, for example. And then also add additional dirt layers, some grunge values, in order to kind of highlight the entire shape and get more detail out of those entire pieces. And right now I'm just making use out of this metal. I'm also, I think, in order to make it look, in order to stand out some of those details, I made another fillet on top of it, which had some white spots, and that just kind of broken up the entire shape of that metal. I think it turned out quite nice, but I might have overdone it looking at it back though. Even in my references, the color itself stands out quite well, the bluish kind of a tint that you get on the metal, and it's often seen as solid blue. But of course, since we're making it a stylized piece, I wanted to fit in more with the scene, and adding a type of a grunge just allows me to highlight a certain bit of that shape, and I just quite like working in that kind of an art style. So yeah, that's my reasoning for why I kind of made the overall metal a little bit more graded than it already is. And yeah, moving on, in order to set up the overall road going across the tower bridge, I wanted to figure out how I'm going to do it in regards to the asphalt itself. So I set up a very basic type of a road material with some grunge overlays, and it turned out quite nicely. And then I had to figure out what I'm going to do in regards to the shape of the lines, and I was actually trying to figure out if I'm just going to get a nicely painted lines manually, just masking out the entire section, but I reckon that wouldn't look quite as nice, as you wouldn't be able to get those perfectly straight lines, and it just wouldn't give us the right kind of results. So what I ended up doing is actually just making use out of the 3D projection, planar projection actually, in order to set it up across the bridge. And I just made sure I place it right in the middle, extended the both ends, and then I was able to get some real nice lines. As for the middle section, for example, in order to get those white lines, I just made use out of the same kind of a method, and just made sure I used an alpha, square-ish alpha, which allowed me to make a repetition kind of a look of a pattern. I squished down that square, of course, and that gave us some really nice streak of lines going across the bridge. So the upside of doing that is, because when we're going to be texturing the other parts of the road, because our bridge has multiple materials, we'd be able to get exactly the same size and exactly the same type of a look within our tower bridge, simply because we'd be able to copy this entire layer onto the other pieces, and that way we'll be able to project it in the right kind of a size, as well as the right type of a position, which will turn out quite nicely. And of course, to break off the lines a little bit, to make it a little bit more grungy, I used a mask on top of it with a subtract blending of a grunge map, and that just gave me some ways to break off the entire line and just not make it look like it's been perfectly fresh painted on. And so it gives us a bit of an edge wear to them as well. So yeah, once I was happy with that, I wanted to continue on working with the base section of the tower bridge. I ended up just making a real nice concrete for that, and in order to highlight the base itself, I think I made use out of the brick layer that I had previously for the tower bridge, but this time I wanted to add an additional grunge map. Since it's going to be always exposed to the weathering and to the water itself, we had to make sure it has that type of a look to it, and it turned out quite alright. But anyways, moving on, once I was done with one side of the tower, we basically had to continue on working on the other side as well. And looking back at it though, if I was to use something like Udemy maps, I would have been able to work with multiple materials, multiple texture maps at once, and work with asymmetry on both ends of the tower and just get faster type of results out of the masking. But it was quite alright in regards to redoing the other side as well, since we already had most of our texture maps set up. All we had to do was basically just copy and paste all of the textures and just make sure that they're masked out properly. The masking itself wasn't that bad, to be honest, because I already knew how to mask out the other tower, I just had to make use out of the symmetry in order to get a really type of a faster result. And I think during this process I realized that I didn't have anything for the top section of the tower bridge. There is a bit of a gold type of a look for the material on top of it. So I ended up just quickly making a nice material for that in regards to how it looks. I ended up using some additional overlays for the grunge masks, and just to highlight the entire shape for that bit I made use out of a curvature mask, and that just gave us a really nice type of a base for the metal of a gold. And yeah, once I was happy with that, of course we had to continue on with the middle section of the tower bridge, and I was trying to figure out how I'm going to make use out of the already existing materials that I created previously for the tower. And I started off by just masking out the entire look, or where the white color would go for where the blue color would go, and just making sure it looks quite nice in regards to that. Of course I wanted to highlight the overall shape, so I made use out of an ambient occlusion actually in order for those bits of a white metal, especially in order to highlight more of a complex type of shape. Of course, since it is a stylus bridge, we're able to do that to make use out of all of our textures in order to get a more creative freedom out of this piece. But yeah, moving on, I realized that we're not going to have a nice look out of our bridge if we just keep it empty as is. So I wanted to create some emblems, some crests for the tower bridge, and make it look much nicer in regards to the overall design of a bridge. It was really hard to see out of the references what kind of crests we're having within the top section, and even when I found after some research, it was actually really hard to get some good references to use to just Photoshop it out. But I just got some similar look out of what I wanted, and I just ended up making use out of them. I basically created myself a Photoshop texture. I just cut out that piece, and in order to set it all up, I started off by getting a nice cutout to make an opacity texture map, which then would allow me to basically stamp it out the detail itself. Then of course for the color, we just made use out of the same texture, and I also, in order to get some additional detail, I just made use out of a height texture volumes as well. So I think I used color selection in order to get the most lit up areas, and I just kind of blurred it out a little bit, and that allowed me to get some really nice height values for this regard. Of course by default it was a little bit too high, so I had to lower it all the way down, and just it turned out quite well. So I got myself a couple of extra crests, and actually what I did not mention is that I realized that the crests on the bridge actually have this type of a golden tint to that, so I wanted to keep up with the overall pattern. And we also have some bits on the top of the tower that are golden as well, so in order to make it look nicer, I actually end up changing up the color for all of those symbols that I'm making use out of, and painted them a yellow as well. Just got myself a nice overlay, and I was able to make use out of that. But yeah, during this process I didn't get like perfect shots, perfect angles of my references of the textures that I was using. So of course the first thing that we have to do is make sure that in regards to the perspective, it is perfectly facing in front of us. So I used some warping methods in order to get nicer kind of a look, kind of a shape out of all of our crests. And then afterwards it was relatively easy. We just use a smart selection to just mask out our entire section of what we want to have in regards to the stamp. And yeah, just like we did before, we create ourselves an opacity, we have the texture already, and we just for a good measure we create ourselves a height value as well, just to get more bump value out of this entire section. And yeah, afterwards, once we're done setting it all up, it was rather simple process. Afterwards all we had to do was basically just stamp it out in the right kind of places to give us a really nice type of a look out of those crests. And I think it turned out quite alright. I think I do come back to it though, just to make sure that we have some additional looks, the edges of the tower bridge. But to move on, I really wanted to texture the platform itself. I think it was just standing out too much, and I wasn't able to focus on the smaller details of texturing for the tower bridge itself. So I ended up just getting myself that same type of a texture that I had previously. I just made use out of that. And in order to get more detail out of this entire section, because we're using an entire material for that, I just wanted to break up the brick pattern a little bit more. So I just ended up using a grunge mask, make it look a little bit more gritty. And then once I was happy with that, I continued on working with the water within a bridge. I started off rather blue because the references were quite blue, but it didn't quite fit the overall design, so I actually ended up just giving it a green type of a tint in the end. But yeah, moving on. To make this type of a water, I add a really nice base type of a texture already set up with a simple color value as well as a normal texture as well. And in order to highlight the edges of where the tower is, got myself this nice type of a brush. I think it was a Photoshop brush actually, of a foam which had a bunch of different textures from within it, which then allowed me to stamp out some of that detail for the tower. The downside of it though was that it didn't actually have some nice edges or when I was importing it into the Substance Painter. So what I had to do was I had to make use out of an eraser with some very smooth edges, and that way I was able to kind of blend in with the rest of the water texture, that entire stamp. I think it turned out quite alright. So yeah, it looked quite nice. And going back to the towers, I then started basically stamp out all the detail within the towers themselves. I didn't want to overdo it, but just in areas where it looked a little bit empty, I ended up getting some of those stamps in, and I think it turned out quite alright. They were quite small details, so they're not even going to be visible on what exactly type of their texture that they're going to have, but just knowing that there's something extra of that detail will make the entire asset, the entire tower bridge look that much nicer. And yeah, I almost forgot, we also have some of the spotlights placed on the side of a platform, since we were thinking about setting it all up to have some nice spotlights in the evening in the future for when we're placing it within the Unreal Engine. So of course we had to make sure we texture them out as well. Can't have just light sources be coming out of nowhere, so of course we had meshes for that. And I added some basic metal that I always make use out of within my projects. And in regards to the main spotlight area for where the light is coming out, we just had to make sure we set up a channel with an emission map, which is going to give us a nice type of a glow in the end. And I think I left the spotlights by default as just a plain yellow, but it doesn't look quite as right, so I wanted to add some iron bars, some additional type of a pattern for them. And also when we're doing that, we gotta make sure we apply a bit of a black emission map on top of our already painted emissive texture map, since otherwise, even if you do have textures underneath, they're not going to be quite as visible because it's going to be overlaid with emissive texture map on top of it. So whenever you're working with emission map, you also got to make sure you add some pattern, some look onto the emissive texture map as well. And yeah, then afterwards I think I went back to the water. I added a translucency to it as well. And in order to add a translucency, you firstly have to change the material of a mesh to be using PBR with alpha translucency, and that allows us to then go and add a channel with an opacity mask. And then afterwards it's rather easy to make use out of it. All you gotta do is just enable the channel within your fill layer and just change it to any way you want. And also, just to make it look a little bit better, I made use out of a thickness texture map, and with some level adjustments I was able to get a really nice type of a mask, which allowed me to overlay that with the opacity mask, and that way we get some depth out of our entire water texture, which turned out quite alright, to be honest. I quite liked it. So yeah, moving on then to work on those finer details of our tower bridge. I was trying to figure out how we're going to do it for the entire section of the windows. They didn't look quite alright, they didn't look quite as nice, they didn't have as much of a detail, so I wanted to mask them out. And while doing that, I realized that going back to the projection of the road, we encountered a couple of issues. So the downside of using the projection mask is that you need to be very careful in regards to how you're projecting it, because I was doing it from the top all the way to down, like kind of in a vertical motion. It was applying everything, not only for the top road section, it was also applying that type of a projection onto our entire bridge, onto the base as well, and it just kind of ends up bleeding out that type of an alpha mask. So we gotta make sure we mask it out afterwards and just make sure it doesn't give us any nasty type of a result. But yeah, once we're done with that, in order to continue moving on with the texturing process, I basically was pretty much done in regards to the texturing, but we just had to tweak a couple of additional values. So for example, I went back to the lantern. I didn't like the pattern the way I had it set up, so I wanted to get a nicer type of a look out of that. And I was trying to figure out what I'm going to use. I was actually trying to make use out of a brick type of a generator as well, because that would have given us a nice type of a look. And I think I did make use out of that actually. I just had to make sure that there are no variations, and it would just get a really nice type of a square look for them. And by using projection tool, I was able to make sure that there are no UV seams in those areas as well. I just had to set it up diagonally, and that just gave us some really non-distorted type of a nice look for the entire pattern of the lanterns. But yeah, moving on, I actually encountered another issue while texturing this. I think some of the windows, some of the patterns for those windows were overlapping with one another, and I wasn't able to mask out certain frame sections for the tower. And when I realized that, I was slightly annoyed because I didn't get the right type of a result, but it was a rather easy fix. All I had to do was just simply go into Blender real quick, make sure I unwrap the windows again, and then just use the project configuration in order to replace the mesh. And of course, because we were using generator masks, we just had to rebake mesh maps, and that just gave us the right type of a texture that we had previously. And even the type of strokes that we had with the brush, or any stamps that we applied with projection, all of those are going to be preserved within the position of the world, so they're going to be easily kept the same as it was. But moving on, I still wasn't quite happy with the way the windows turned out. At first I tried to kind of make use out of a large brush and brush out certain details of like dust and whatnot in order to highlight the overall shape, and I wasn't quite happy with the way it was turning out actually. So I think in the end I had to go into it and just mask out them manually. So, but yeah, I then realized that I didn't quite like the overall color of the water. Last time I was at the place, it didn't look quite as bluish. It's not some sort of a tropical type of a look that I'm going for. Plus the overall art style that I use to texture is more of a gritty look, so the bluish type of a water that we had previously didn't look quite as well. So by just changing it to a bit more of a less saturated green tint, I was able to get much nicer type of a look, type of an atmosphere out of this entire environment. And yeah, going back to the roads, I had to fix up all the small masking that I missed out basically, because there were so many small details that we were masking out. We had to make sure that they're masked in properly, and the bits like in underneath the bridge, for example, you also have to have certain texture, otherwise they're just going to be left off as is, and they're not going to look quite as nice. They're going to stand out in the end, since they're going to be the only places that aren't textured. So of course we had to make sure to have nice material set up. And then yeah, as the last piece in regards to the windows, at first I tried to make use out of ambient occlusion, then that gives us some nice type of a mask. Especially if you invert it, you're able to kind of mask out the areas around the frames. But in regards to this section, because the windows were placed all over the mesh basically in different positions, that didn't give us an overall type of a look from the ambient occlusion. So what I had to do, basically I had to go in manually with the symmetry mode, which kind of sped up the overall type of a flow for this entire work. And I basically just had to mask out each and every bit of the window and kind of highlight the overall shape from them, which was honestly a bit of a tedious work, but all in all, I think it was worth it. It turned out really nicely in regards to the windows. It brought up the entire shape to look quite nice. So yeah, once we were done with that, once we were finished with the overall texturing process, all we had to do is just export everything out in 4K, and we were pretty much ready to move on to the Unreal Engine 5 part. Alright, now that we are within the environment setup part of the video, we're going to set it up using Unreal Engine 5. And the first thing that I like to do is just make use out of third-person template and create myself a new level from within it, just to avoid making use out of all of these template level assets while still getting ourselves a nice setup to begin with. And in order to get ourselves the mesh imported, I firstly had to make sure I export out from Blender the FBX file. with all the static motion. And then in regards to the animated bridge, I had to make sure I import that in as an animated type of a skeletal bone asset, which just made sure that all the animations that were set up within Blender are now going to be able to work properly within this type of a setup. And then afterwards, all we had to do was just set up all the textures to be used for the bridge itself. So after exporting it all out from within the Substance Painter, we just had to make sure we create ourselves a new PBR material within Unreal Engine and then make a material instance out of it, and then assign all of those textures. But before doing that, I also wanted to set up a nice water material for this type of environment, because we already had some textures from Substance Painter. I wanted to make use out of them, so I had to make a new single layer water material for this type of a scene from scratch. And I just basically kind of overlap those materials with also additional like normal panning motion that was giving us some nice type of a result out of this type of water. So yeah, it was looking pretty nice in regards to that. I also had to just play around with the absorption values and whatnot to get a nicer type of a result. And whilst creating that, I also want to say how important it is to just create yourselves a material instance. That way you'll be able to adjust the parameters real time and get some really nice results out of your material, and just to see how it looks. I think I actually set up a bit of a too much of a bluish tint to start off, but I'm going to be changing that in a moment. But yeah, as for the normal values, in order to allow us to get better results out of them, we use lerp value with a vector free type of a node, and we set up that vector free to be just a blue tint, just a completely blue tint type of a look, and we kind of overlay the normals with that blue. And as for the alpha, we simply get ourselves a type of a float parameter that allows us to control it, and so we're able to get some real nice results out of that. And yeah, after that I just amplified the normals, I think, by quite a bit, which gave us some really nice motion for the waves. And of course, by just setting up those parameters and playing around with them, we're able to get some really nice water results out of this entire material. And yeah, after I was happy with that, all we had to do is just set up a really nice base for the bottom of our scene, just to get some nice kind of highlights out of this entire environment, and just to make sure that we are getting some nice transition in the background. And as for the background, we're also making use out of a height fog as well, and that just gives us some really nice results in regards to that. And I think I'm just making use out of a default type of a cloud system for the background, as I found it to be quite nice already as is, so I didn't even touch it. But in case you're wondering on how to set them up, you can make use out of the material instance that it already has created, and just make a copy out of it, put it in your content browser, and that way you're able to make any types of adjustments in regards to the noise and how they behave. Yeah, it's always quite nice. So afterwards we had to set up a little bit more in regards to how the lighting is set up, and I actually wanted to make use out of a light cycle type of a look for the bridge, so it would look more of a time lapse. Since the bridge itself is actually being raised quite slowly in real time, and this type of animation is quite fast, I also wanted to make it look like the entire day is going fast. And also this allowed me to make use out of the spotlights. I wanted to make sure that we're seeing day and night of this type of environment. And of course, when we're having a dawn type of a look, I just made sure to set up some lights, some really nice lights within the scene. And in order to get those spotlights, the shape of the entire type of a look from the lights, so height map. So height map fog allows us to also enable the volumetric fog for the spotlights as well. And then afterwards, I think I changed up the scattering color of the volumetric fog from within the spotlights themselves, the parameters that they have, in order to kind of control how much of a shape we're seeing through the fog for those lights. And by just playing around, we're getting some real nice results. We can't overdo it in regards to the intensity of the fog, because when the sun goes to the other side, it looks a little bit too much in regards to the overall kind of visuals that we're getting out of it. The fog just kind of gives us some nasty silhouettes if we overdo them basically. So yeah, we gotta make sure we tweak out the values and get the right type of result for both the daylight scene and the night light scene as well. So yeah, after I was happy with that, in order to make sure that we're getting a nice type of emotion out of the entire scene, we had to set up those direct lights to be activated whenever the sun goes down, and that way it just brings some life to our entire area. I was really happy with the way this was working out. So it doesn't take as much to set up this entire scene. The most troublesome stuff was within the level sequencer, within the animations itself, just making sure that we're getting some nice results. And when I was working with actually lighting setup for the evening, I was trying to figure out whether or not it's going to look nice in regards to the overall setup in the silhouettes, because I think I was having the sun a little bit too low in that area. I think I raised it up just a little bit more to get some nicer lighting coming out of our environment. And I also made sure to change up some indirect lighting for the scene as well, in order to get that ambient type of a light to look a bit nicer for the night scene. And of course, we also got to make sure that the day scene is going to look quite as nice as well. So we got to go basically between those two and make sure that both of the parameters for the indirect lighting, the way they bounce it off, is going to look quite nice. And also, just a quick note, if you do want to get yourself some nicer type of a lighting within your scene, just make sure that within your skybox you increase intensity. That way you're able to get a nicer type of an ambient look for the overall environment. But you just gotta make sure you not to overdo it, otherwise we don't get any of the darker areas and the overall kind of a scene would look a little bit too flat. So I recommend you not to go over anything like of a value of intensity of 5 from the read light sources. But if you're using a cube map in order to get some nicer reflections for your scene, of course that'd be a bit different in regards to what kind of intensity you'd want to make use out of. But yeah, going back to the level sequence setup, I was basically setting up all the renders for this scene, and I gotta make sure I highlight some of those areas for this entire London Tower Bridge. So yeah, the first shot is of course gotta be like the main compositional type of a shot. Then of course we gotta showcase the entire type of a look out of our environment using the turntable, which is the most common type of a shot, in order to get a nice type of a look out of your entire scene, just to showcase the entire environment. Then afterwards we had to think in regards to how we're going to set up the other shots, the more close-up type of shots within the scene. So I was trying to highlight certain areas that wanted to get a really nice type of a look for the overall tower. And I think one of the shots that I made was from a low type of an angle, just to show the grand scale of this entire type of a bridge, which I think turned out quite nicely. In regards to that, I quite like that type of a shot. Then afterwards we just got some additional couple of extra shots in regards to more of a looking down type of a look. As the camera was already like pretty much like floating in the air, I figured that would be a much nicer type of a look. And I think when setting up the cameras, I was also playing up with the focal type of a shot to get a more FOV from our scene, especially from the shots that were more close up. That way we'd be able to get some nice distortion and make the entire scene, in my opinion, to look more grand. So yeah, after that I was just playing around more with the overall composition, with the overall design. And once I was happy with that, of course we had to set up some post-processing. I just set up some very basic one, actually just got a bit more of a contrast out of the entire scene. Made sure that the gamma color grading is also set up a little bit, just to kind of complement that contrast that we had previously. And then afterwards I also turned on the bloom functionality from within Unreal Engine post-process, just to get a nicer type of a lighting setup coming out of our spotlights. So yeah, once we were done with that, we were pretty much ready to go, and we just had to render everything out. Now that we're finished with it all, let's go ahead and review the entire process. The modeling part took 5 hours and 45 minutes for Neil to create this building, as it is deceptively difficult. If you take a look at the silhouette of the model, it'll look quite simple with a lot of parts being mirrored. However, there are a high number of intricate parts, and although this model could have been taken much further, there is still a high amount of knowledge needed to create an overall result. This model would be ideally suited to a mid-level modelist who would find it an overall challenge bringing all the parts together. You will need a good knowledge of Blender modifier functions together with a fair amount of skill already achieved with a Blender modeling kit set. The animation is very straightforward, just be sure to add a root bone to rename the armature so as not to cause any issues when importing it to Unreal. Overall, Neil is going to give this one a 7 out of 10, but this number would be much higher if you were to add more intricate detail to it. Now as for the texturing part, the whole scene took 5 hours to paint as I wanted to take my time and make sure to recreate the tower bridge to the best of my ability while still giving it some of our unique stylized style that we usually add to our environments. There's a lot of work with the brick patterns involved whilst texturing this model, which might be a little bit overwhelming to a newer artist, especially if you're not familiar with its parameters for the generator. Working with existing buildings and texturing their design is always difficult in my opinion, as you really have to be careful with its detail. You often need to go back to your references and study its texture from close up to make sure you get the right type of a look. All of which whilst making sure you don't get a sort of a tunnel vision and painting a building as a whole to make sure that all of its color gets fitted properly within the overall type of an environment. The final thing that I would say is that whilst creating the straight roads, it might look easy, but if you're working with the road on multiple materials, you need to always keep in mind to make sure to get the right kind of consistent pattern throughout it, which with the help of a planar projection can be easily achieved. So yeah, all in all, I'm also giving this part a 7 out of 10 as there is a need to give an extra care to the detail for the landmark. The environment setup only took 1 hour and 45 minutes to create, as we make use out of the default Unreal Engine atmosphere and we basically allowed it to do most of the heavy lifting in regards to setting up the scene. I wanted to give the scene a sense of flow for the time throughout the presentation, and it was a relatively fast and easy approach since the directional kind of a lighting from within the scene is already attached to the parameters with our atmosphere. By simply rotating the light source, we're able to get a nice motion of a sun, so it was quite nice. All we had to do was work around with it later on and get proper adjustments, things like spotlights for example. Since we already had them attached to our platforms, of course we had to make use out of them, so we set up some light sources to them and activated all of them throughout the level sequence. Then another hard part is in regards to setting up a sort of a time-lapse composition is that we had to make sure that the post-process looks quite right in both lighting. So I tweaked a couple of values whilst looking at the darker and a brighter atmosphere simultaneously. Finally, whilst working on this, I created a quick water material from scratch to make sure that we are using our already existing textures from Substance Painter and giving our body of fluid some motion. It is a simple setup, but the difficulty comes from tweaking its parameters to get the right type of a water material, which might be a little bit difficult for a beginner. So all in all, I'm going to give this scene a 5 out of 10 as it is a rather fast scene to set up, but without a certain amount of knowledge within Unreal Engine 5, a beginner can easily get overwhelmed. So yeah, I really hope you enjoyed the video for a Blender free to Unreal Engine 5 London Bridge miniature model and environment video. Make sure to give us a like if you did, and don't forget to drop a comment down below of what you would like to see us do next. Also, check out the links down below to see a massive library of courses we have available, which are free to anyone that signs up to our Patreon. Our newest course involves creating an environment from scratch within Unreal Engine 5, so be sure to check that out as well. We also have some free goods on our Gumroad, things like texture packs and some models for anyone to download, which, speaking of, we just got a really nice decal pack for everyone to check out. So yeah, that'll be all. Thanks for watching and I'll see you in the next one.